Welcome to the Curious Cult podcast. I am your obsessively curious host, Nick Haralambou, and today I am really excited to be talking to Trip Hawkins about his curiosity. Trip is an incredibly accomplished entrepreneur who has a vast breadth of skill and depth of experience. He's the founder and first CEO of Electronic Arts, was crowned King of the Nerds by The Economist, and he designed, produced, and marketed his first game while still a teenager, and at that young age, mapped out a 10-year plan that led him to founding Electronic Arts. Trip, thank you for joining me today to discuss my favorite topic, curiosity.
Well, thank you, and it's a great topic from my perspective. I think I only really noticed in the last 5 years exactly how relentlessly curious I am, and began to realize, and I agree with you about it as a theme. I realized that it was a really fundamental aspect of who I am and what caused me to be a lifelong learner and to have the kind of career that I had. And it's a topic that I regularly bring up now with entrepreneurs that I talk to regularly.
You say in the last, give or take 5 years, what made you gain that perspective that curiosity was so important?
I started to have more opportunity for reflection. And a lot of this just has to do with the fact that, we get older, we accumulate experience, we have more of our own personal history to reflect on. 5 years ago, I also transitioned from having spent 30, 40 years founding companies and being a CEO and being a leader right out on the battlefield, which is pretty hectic. And you step back from that. And it was stepping back from that, but stepping forward into being more of a teacher. I started having clients in a business consulting practice where I thought, I'm going to go help the next generation. I want to have a slightly less complicated lifestyle. I don't want to feel like I'm having to work 24/7 to keep a startup alive. I want to spend more time with my 4 children and with my wife and just have a somewhat different lifestyle. But I have plenty of time to help young entrepreneurs that are going through the very things that I've been through many times. And people would more regularly, not just the media, I've been asked by the media countless times, what was the key to your success? So that's another example of the kind of question. When you ask that question, you need to spend some time reflecting and really figuring out, who am I? And I would say I've done a lot more work in the last 5 years trying to understand identity and how innovation and entrepreneurship really work. And then I got hired to be a professor at the University of California. I did that for about 3.5 years. Again, I had several classrooms full of people wanting to know whether or not they should do it. Actually, a lot of times they didn't know that's what they needed to know. I realized myself that I better tell them that because it's really not for everyone. But they certainly, again, asked me a lot of questions, and I really had to think hard in the last 5 years. Well, what do I really know?
When you were a kid, were you always curious? Do you recall just being, like you said, relentlessly curious?
Yes, very, very much so.
And you mentioned you've got 4 kids. How do you promote curiosity in your children?
Well, you want to be open and flexible and kind of tune into what they're curious about, where they seem to get excited and evidence some degree of passion. Like some little kids will just jump on a musical instrument and start goofing around with it, and others just don't care about it. So for example, you might sense that, okay, here's someone who's got enough curiosity about music that they maybe are going to be a better candidate for some instruction and development. Same thing with the kid that is really mechanical about wanting to take things apart and put things together and kind of understand systems. I mean, there's just all kinds of things that show up. Also stories. Storytelling is such a fundamental, deep part of the human condition. We wouldn't really be human without stories. And right from the very beginning, we are telling ourselves stories about the reality that we're perceiving and about who we think we are. and there's a lot of things as children that we don't understand because we don't have any experience, we don't have any maturity, so there's a lot to not understand, and we're just observing, and we don't understand what's happening in the adult relationships. We don't often correctly interpret how we're treated, so it's very easy to get hurt and to misunderstand things. And then the ego, to protect us, starts crafting stories. And so we go through life really responding and catering to the stories that are in our head. And that's another dimension to tune into with kids is, are they really interested in stories? Are they potentially someone who's able to have the imagination to make up stories? And I was that kind of kid. I was already at a very young age creating really elaborate fantasy worlds and taking parts of this toy and connecting with the parts of that toy and integrating things together into a really vast fantasy world. So, and it was pretty clear that, I would go over to friends' house and, say, they're not doing anything on this level.
You mentioned a couple of words that triggered some thoughts for me around kids, and what I think makes kids so brilliant at being curious is they actually don't have what we as adults know as ego, and they don't have a fear of failure. And I think both of those things in adults prevent curiosity. How do you feel about that statement?
Well, I'm going to relate a word that's a very big part of my life: play. What you see transition from childhood to adult is a lot of people saying, okay, play is for children. When we're adults, we have to stop playing and take things seriously, and what we're doing is work. When you think about work versus play, they really involve a lot of the same physical movements, involve a lot of the drawing on the same mental capacities, so the kinds of thinking and creativity and analysis and counting. And yet we can look at some human activities and say, oh my God, there's no way I could do that for more than an hour without being bored to death. Or it feels like something that only a prisoner in a prison ought to be forced labor to do. It's inhumane. And then on the other hand, there's things that we're happy to do over and over and over, and that we never get tired of. That's a really super important thing to tune into, is just to notice in yourself, all right, what am I drawn to? What for me feels like play? And then, the point you're making is that something happens along the way where people stop being playful. And so, I think it is related to what you said about risk-taking and open-mindedness. And it's really important to help kids hang on to that as they get older and they start being forced by institutional structure in our world, in our society, in our culture. But you can still maintain that if you work at it.
Agreed. And you've worked with some absolutely incredible people, one of which being Steve Jobs. Did he have that sense of play and curiosity and risk-taking that you're talking about?
Yes. And the other thing about Steve you have to realize is that, in fact, my opinion of his Myers-Briggs personality type is a particular type profile. And I kind of figured this out just from, I worked closely with the guy for 4 years. We were pretty close friends. We even shared a few of the same girlfriends. We were close. And, you have a lot of personal conversation, a lot of personal, intimate experiences, people. So you can think about a person that you know that well and say, okay, was this person an extrovert or an introvert? I mean, I don't find it that difficult because I've worked with Myers-Briggs as a, testing profile quite a bit. So I can often even meet a stranger and within 5 minutes, I will basically say, I think this is what type you are. And I'll explain it to them and I'll ask them, does that sound about right? So I don't think it's actually that hard to figure out. But it turns out that the type that I think Steve was is called the debater. And if you think about the actual experience he had, the guy did not like school. He couldn't sit still in the classroom all day. He basically started skipping school and doing things that were more interesting outside of the classroom. He spent a lot of time with his stepfather, Paul Jobs, who was a great teacher and brought him into a lot of his hobbies and there's a lot of stories that Steve later told about what he learned from building a fence and caring about the backside of the fence that nobody was going to see. That's one of the anecdotes about his design sensibility and wanting to have the inside of a machine be aesthetically pleasing. But at any rate, then he's obviously famous for basically being kind of a high school dropout. I don't mean he literally dropped out of high school, but he clearly wasn't spending a lot of time in class. He was spending a lot of time with Woz, and they were inventing stuff and doing things. And then he went off to India for a while, and then he went to Reed College for a while, and he dropped out of there right away. So when you talk about what he was like, and I started working with him, he was probably something like 22 or 23 when I started working with him. He really had not gone to school, and he didn't know the things. He didn't know the things that people learn from books and learn from teachers in school. So he had to conduct a Socratic dialogue with really smart people around him to try to figure out what he thought about things. So he was in constant conversation, in constant debate, and essentially constantly arguing with a very simple purpose that he and I shared, which is the quest for the truth. So, okay, we're going to argue until we beat this thing to death. We figure out what's absolutely true, or we figure out what it is we don't know that we have to go learn and prove in order to get to the truth. And not taking it personally when people disagree, and instead being curious about why they disagree and where they're coming from and what's the evidence. So it's funny because obviously Steve is really famous for blowing people up and getting really mad about things that he thought weren't well done, and being, not being able to control his emotions when he was disappointed. But there was kind of an inner circle of people like myself that he respected, because we were the right kind of people for him to bounce things off of, help him refine his thinking. So yeah, he was just literally living in and dwelling in his curiosity and bringing other people in, kind of a salon.
And in your life, either early or currently, can you think of an example of your curiosity that stands out, that's very odd for the kind of work you're in? I mean, curiosity, like you're saying with Steve, is vast and deep. Is there anything that stands out in your mind as an example?
Well, when I go back to my childhood and think about aspects of curiosity as a child, one of them is that I had a short walk to the elementary school I went to, and I would walk often alone or with a friend and go by a really dilapidated old house with a really rundown yard, and hadn't been painted in decades. And there was a super creepy old man that lived there. So it was literally like having a haunted house on your walk to school. And I was just super curious about that guy and that place. And so among the friends group that I was in, I was the one who would do the provocative things like open the gate and go up to the front door and look in through the open screen. And I would be the one that would ring the doorbell and, so one of the things about curiosity is that, and as it kind of ties into innovation and technology and entrepreneurship, it does involve risk. You've got to be prepared to go into the unknown, and you have to be willing to be a little exposed. And even at a minimum, intellectually, you're potentially going to find out that something that you're really attached to is false. So just right there's an intellectual threat from your own curiosity. But then there's also other kinds of danger. I mean, who knows what could have happened physically, if that guy had pulled out a gun or kidnapped me or whatever. And then I would say what's more career-oriented for me is that I still kind of find it amazing that I was so young. I mean, I was really just a kid, and I found myself drawn to games, which at that time were just board games, card games, etc. But I really loved games that were trying to simulate either some interesting phenomenon from adult life. Even a game like Monopoly is trying to do that. So in the case of Monopoly, okay, we're going to do property development. We're going to be real estate people that are going to develop and trade properties, try to run a business and collect more rent than what we're incurring in our capital costs. I mean, and obviously there's a lot of negotiating and maneuvering involved in Monopoly because you're trying to figure out how to create leverage over others. So you're kind of learning some of the most fundamental tools that have to do with persuasion and negotiating and establishing yourself in business models and carving out a place in a value chain in an industry. You just don't even realize that that's what you're learning. And honestly, that's a really shallow example, and I still managed to pump some life into it. There were far more interesting simulations to me, and I'll give you a couple of concrete examples. So one would be something like Dungeons and Dragons. And of course, Dungeons and Dragons is a fantasy. You have dragons, you have magic spells, etc. You have mythological creatures. But it's actually portraying a lot of realism in the situations that you find yourself in. You're navigating your way through a map and through dungeons. You're assessing risk. You're trying to decide when to fight and when to flee. You're having conversations with various characters. You're trying to collaborate in a team, sometimes having team members betray you. And there's a lot of stuff that goes on in D&D that is, in fact, the kind of stuff that goes on in adult human life. So, and it's a super geeky game, as you know. And meanwhile, I discovered in myself a real passion for complicated team sports like football and baseball, where I could tell there was a lot of strategy, and where I could apply my mind to that and try to figure out, hey, is there a way I could be smarter about this and have an advantage? And I thought about that both as from a coach's perspective or even a team owner's perspective, and also as a player's perspective. And then I discovered, again, I was just a kid, I discovered statistics. So there were a couple of big breakthroughs for a kid. One of them was trying to get people to play these games with me, and there were a few sports equivalents where they were simulating a sport, kind of like the D&D of football or the D&D of baseball. And I discovered these back in the 1960s, and I would try to get my friends to play with them. And then I noticed that the friends that were just as geeky as me, that really loved strategy and liked to play war games and liked stats and liked resource management. So those are the handful of friends that I picked out. Okay, these are really great friends. And guess what? That was over 50 years ago. These people are still my best friends. I'm competing with these people. We still play games, and we're competing and thinking about each other's competitors every day of the year. You talk about resonating with something that's a really deep, true part of yourself. But meanwhile, most of my friends would get bored, and they would drift off and watch television. And I would literally look into the other room that they had drifted into and say, well, okay, they won't play this game with me. Shoot, I want people to play with me. And why are they going off to watch the TV? And I would see what was on the screen. There's these flickering animated images going by on the screen. And I kind of grew through the transition from black and white into color television. It got more dynamic. And you can see, yeah, it's fairly captivating. And there's almost no effort. And that was one of the awarenesses that I had. Again, curiosity coming into this, realizing what's going on when you're watching TV. You're passive. You're relaxed, you're kind of dumbing yourself down, you're not really thinking. This is before anybody even called it the boob tube. And then I noticed in games, I was all fired up and I was excited and my mind was on fire. And I thought, this is better. There's something better here about interacting with something. And so I kind of understood this principle from play and just observing myself at play. That was actually later proven by brain scientists at the University of California that proved, this woman named Marion Diamond led this research that proved scientifically that the single best way to increase human intelligence is through interaction. And of course, as we know now, the most potent form of simulated interaction, that's not, say, real world interaction, because if I want to know how to fly a jet fighter, I could go pay a huge amount of money and buy a jet fighter or rent one and hire instructors, and I'd probably get myself killed, right? But what we know is that I can now just use almost any computer or even a mobile phone, and I can fly any dang airplane that's ever been invented. And I can crash hundreds of millions of dollars worth of aircraft without anyone actually getting hurt. So the power of simulation, it was just really clear to me. But I realized I'm looking over at the TV and I'm thinking, you know what? It's got to be more like TV, because, you know, when you play, say, a game like Dungeons and Dragons, there's all this administration you're doing just to manage all of the information and to keep track of all the data and the stats and the probabilities and everything else. And I was okay with doing that because I'm geeky enough for it. And for a nerdy enough person, even that part is kind of fun. But the mainstream human beings, no. You know, that's something that really ought to be done by a machine. And then, of course, I had the good fortune to find out about computers. And then, you know, as I grew and, you know, became a teenager, I started to discover that, wow, computers are actually a thing, and they're getting cheaper all the time, and they're gradually going to poke into homes, and there's going to be a way to make games where you put all the administrative stuff inside the box, and you present it as real life in a box, and you make it look like television.
And there's such an incredible link from curiosity as a kid playing D&D to interacting with the sport as a coach and a player, all these wide varieties of things that interested you, and then leading into founding Electronic Arts, which is the clear path. I mean, your interest in sports and D&D and television and computers are wide and different, and you would never expect people to put them together. But given enough time from when you were a kid to when computers were able to do the things you needed them to do, that obviously led you to founding Electronic Arts.
Right. And by the way, I started consciously thinking about starting a company that would make video games around 1970. So again, I am still a teenager, and I'm I'm imagining that it's going to take quite a while before I can really do it. And in 1975, I heard a few things again that for me were like blockbuster ideas that I could then project into the future. And so actually in 1975, that's when I decided that I would start Electronic Arts in 1982, which in fact is what I did. So the road to founding Electronic Arts, it was at least 12 years long.
That's amazing. And the thing that interests me the most around that story is around the same time Atari was actually launched. Around 1972 is when Atari launched their brand in their first game. So you were right on the cusp of taking D&D and these old school games into this new world of digital. And I mean, the foresight for someone that young to want to build a business, never mind build a business in technology, is really intriguing. So I want to jump a bit forward into Electronic Arts, and we don't want to stick on that for too long, but at EA and then through your career in the multiple other massive businesses that you've headed, how have you promoted curiosity? I mean, is that something you look for when you hire your team? Is it something you promote openly as a culture? Maybe subconsciously you were doing it, but you know, when you look back, how was curiosity pitched in your organizations?
Well, one thing I want to point out that I noticed really early was, when a new technology comes along, often in its early stage, it's very expensive, because in order for it to become less expensive, things like the manufacturing volume of semiconductors or the density of the semiconductors has to get to a higher level of technology so that you can fit a lot more on a smaller chip that's, because of its smaller size, less expensive to manufacture, and it generates less heat, and you can actually put it in a mobile device without the thing overheating. I mean, there's all these sort of fundamental rules, you know, some of them related to Moore's law. And then there's other factors that just have to do with volume, where, hey, initially you're not going to have a lot of customers, so you're not going to be able to have the efficiency of doing any activity in high volume. Okay, so the earliest computers were, I'm sorry, what I meant was the earliest access that the public had with computers. It was getting letters in the mail saying that you owed somebody some money, and the big computer owned by that institution said so, and there's nothing you can do about it. For most of human history with computers in the 50s, 60s, 70s, it was annoying because big institutions had them and they were used against the public. Okay, so then finally in the 1970s, consumers started getting to touch computers. And ironically, one of those ways was the introduction of the ATM, where they discovered some interesting things like don't put it on the south face of the building. These little old ladies would come up and start touching the screen that had been cooking in the sun and burn their fingertips. It took a while. It took a while to figure out the human interface. So you had the ATM as an early starting point, and then another one was the way students in schools could go use a university computer that was time shared, and you could go to a computing center full of terminals and compete for time on that machine, which is why we all started staying up all night, because you wanted to wait until most of the students were sleeping so that you'd have more compute resource and everything would go faster. Anyway, so that was a touch point. And I remember it was in 1975 that the very first retail store doing anything with computers opened. And lo and behold, I happened to be in the town where it happened, Santa Monica, California. It was Paul Heiser's store called the Computer Store, which later became one of the bigger Apple dealers. And he had terminals that you could rent for $10 an hour. You could take it home and you could tap into your work mainframe, or you could tap into a timeshare system that you had an account with. And that was one of the breakthrough moments where I realized, okay, it's really happening. These are going to get into homes. Okay, so meanwhile, the other way they were showing up was in the arcades, because if I make a Pong game, I can spend $10,000 on it. It doesn't matter how expensive it is to make the thing, because so many quarters are going to get put in it, it's going to make a profit. Lots and lots of the public are going to show up and put money in it. We're not trying to get somebody to put it in their living room and expecting them to spend $10,000 on it. And here's what I noticed, though, is the arcade games basically were only a form of amusement. They were designed to kill your character within 2 minutes and get you to put in more quarters. And they were arbitrarily designed to create confusion and to have it be awkward to win, so that you would have to practice and put more money in it and in order to satisfy yourself that you figured it out. And it was really not very intellectual, and it wasn't really simulating anything from the real world or even an interesting science fiction or fantasy world. And I just kind of dismissed it. And that's where I realized, I don't care about amusement. I don't care about helping people kill time. I want to help people use time and be learning while they're doing it. I want them to be mentally engaged. And if they're mentally engaged, then I know they're going to be learning. And of course, it turns out you're growing your brain cells and neurotransmitter connections, et cetera. But if that happens to be combined with a topic, like back in the early days, there was a famous thing made by the school system in Minnesota called the Oregon Trail that simulated trying to cross the United States and get to Oregon. It was just a simple simulation game. There were some very basic text simulation games like Colossal Cave, et cetera, and they did require a lot of thinking. They didn't have impressive graphics, but that was okay. So again, I was always more in the simulation side and the learning power. And that's why when the critical ideas that I developed that became the pillars of EA strategy, they were all kind of around this idea that, you know what, if this is a really new thing, if there's really never been anything like this in the home and with consumer access, and if it's got a lot of learning power and there's going to be a lot of diversity in terms of the kinds of software that people will have access to. What it is a new medium. And that is a really big deal, a really big deal. And I think I was the first person that really noticed that. And then I was also the first person that said, wait a minute, if it's a new medium, well, Hollywood is the industry that, knows how to connect the public with media. So why don't we take this computer thing that's always been a bunch of geeky engineers selling products to other geeky engineers and selling them to big companies. Why don't we think of this as if it was a Hollywood business? How would we run it? And of course, the core idea, what I always refer to as the big idea, was the idea that the creator of the software is an artist, and that this is a new medium. And okay, now how do you build a company around that idea? So clearly, you've got to be curious enough to just step back and look at it and be able to recognize, wow, this is a new medium. This is a really big deal. And can I make a new Hollywood?
And do you think that there is something to be said for tying your curiosity to some kind of ambition? I suppose someone oh my goodness, I'm going to have to edit this out because it's just flown out of my head. Anyways, we're going to have to move on because I cannot remember the person's name for the life of me that I'm trying to remember. But I am curious about how you feel about your ambition tied to your curiosity, because the truth is you could have been curious about all these things, thought, oh, how do we make a Hollywood business? And then just let the idea peter out.
Well, one thing I had going for me in my childhood is that my family was pretty weird about money. And so money ended up, it became part of my neurosis, that there was shame around money, there was a punishment around money, and there was constant criticism about choices that may or may not produce money. I mean, this is a time period where I think there's a lot of parents telling a lot of kids to prepare to have a job in this post-war economy and do something predictable so that you can stay afloat. And this is, I think, partly because my parents and their parents had been through a lot of crap, in the first half of the 20th century. So, we're all pretty tough, but they were really tough. I mean, their toughness had really been activated. And so they're kind of lecturing me about caution and risk avoidance and, being a great student and then picking a really predictable career path. And you know what? I never wanted any of that. And it became kind of a rallying cry for me personally to think, I'm going to show my parents how to make some money. I'm going to blow their perceptions out of the water because I'm going to invent stuff that's got way more value. And this is one of the things that I think happens to a lot of entrepreneurs when they're young, or even artists, any kind of artist, any kind of creative person, they know they're different. And everybody around them that's conventional is telling them not to do it. Don't be a starving artist. And this is one of the things that happens is a lot of people go, okay, I'll study accounting. Okay, you want me to be a doctor. I mean, there's all kinds of ways that people cave in to all the pressure around them. And a lot of us don't do that. And again, I can't completely understand what it was about me where it didn't matter which authority figure with a ton of experience and success was trying to tell me I was crazy and insist that I stop doing it immediately. And they have me just literally smirk and think, you have no idea what's going to happen, do you? It was just kind of astonishing. I just shrugged it all off and just kept going exactly on the vector that I was on.
Yeah, it's incredible. I mean, it definitely sounds like the restrictions and the boundaries that your parents and the quote unquote adults around you put on you actually pushed you a little bit harder. And it's something that I'm interested in discovering a bit more about. The corporate world's understanding of, quote, like the idea of innovation is often you'll try and innovate with an endless budget and an endless timeline, when in fact it's the box you put on the project that pushes that innovation and that curiosity a little bit further. And it sounds like your younger years were spent rebelling towards curiosity, not against it.
Yes, absolutely. And I had some great role models that were inspiring. I'm a really big believer in heroes. And I didn't, again, I felt it, but I didn't like step back and have the self-awareness to say to myself, wow, heroes are really important to you, and there are reasons why they're important to you. I think one of the things that happens with heroes is that we resonate with traits that those people have that are actually part of us. And they're the most amazing parts of us that we need to activate and develop to really become who we are. And like one of the things I would do in my classes is I would put up a picture of Beyonce, and then I would ask the students, what do you like about Beyonce? And they're thinking, why the heck, I'm taking a business class and this guy's got Beyonce on the screen. Why are we talking about Beyonce? But after a while, you'd realize, and I would say, what do you like about her besides the fact that she can sing and dance? And they would start volunteering things about her personal traits and her values. And then I would use that as a segue into how we gather up the people that we choose to have as our heroes and what it says about who we are at a deeper level. So I think it's super important to have heroes, and then it just kind of plays into your ability to rally around what really matters to you, and these inspiring role models. Again, for me in the 60s, it was really powerful when the Beatles came to America. And I felt like, wow, these guys are really young guys. They came out of nowhere. They're doing something completely different. And everybody is real excited about it. And wow, look at this. And now there's a whole bunch of these bands. And there's a whole industry forming here. And I had the very good fortune to be born and raised in California. And California, for the last 150 years, has been the center of innovation on planet Earth. And so I just had the benefit of being surrounded by it culturally and seeing example after example. If I had been older, maybe I would have noticed the formation of Hollywood and how remarkable that was. That had already been established, but it was a well-known, established part of California. And, there are plenty of other examples. I didn't discover Silicon Valley, obviously, until much later, but I found myself there and I realized, wow, look at what's possible here. So you have the heroes. Yeah, so you have the heroes that are inspiring you, and you have the concrete examples of where the culture is not forbidding something. And I find myself thinking about why is it that the Chinese had this amazing empire, 1,000 years ago, and they didn't bother to build a navy and go discover the Americas. And one part of that answer from historians that I've read is that, they had so many resources right there in China, they didn't really need anything. And then the second thing was it was a monarchy. And basically, if you were a really curious, innovative, entrepreneurial farmer peasant, you really needed to just keep your mouth shut. In fact, if you started talking about doing different things, you'd probably get punished. Whereas it was in Europe, the innovators, like the inventors of the steam engine, the philosophers like John Locke, there were conversations going on, 500 years ago in Italy or 300 years ago in England. There were things happening that supported the curiosity and encouraged the exploration that resulted in the Europeans being the ones that, got to America. And literally the Asians, it's like, they fell so far behind technologically that the reason that countries like Japan later decided, okay, we're going to have to open up a little bit because we got to know what these people know, because right now we're at a political and military disadvantage because we don't know what they have in the way of weapons, just as one example.
There's a very direct correlation between what you've just said and how large corporates are run very similarly, with a head who doesn't allow for too much curiosity, that if the subordinates try and look up from their desks, they might get punched in the face, and it prevents them from being curious from the bottom up and finding these blue ocean technologies. So there's definitely a correlation between that and the corporate world.
Yeah, and by contrast, obviously in Silicon Valley, even when I was finishing school at Stanford, Silicon Valley was in the earliest stage, and pretty much it was a bunch of electrical engineers, like people at Hewlett Packard, making complex instruments that they were selling to other electrical engineers. Nothing had happened yet that would be used by an ordinary member of the public. And, in fact, my classmates all thought I was crazy because of my plan to go into Silicon Valley. They thought, oh, you're just going to get chewed up and spat out because you're not an electrical engineer. That was a widely held belief. And I was the only entrepreneur. I was the only person from my class that went into Silicon Valley to be an entrepreneur. There were a couple other guys that were electrical engineers that got jobs at Hewlett Packard, but otherwise nobody even went down there. They just thought I was crazy. They could tell I had a kind of laser beam focus, and one of the words that was used to describe me was bold. But none of them wanted any part of it. So anyway, if you look at what happened at Apple that I got to participate in and help happen, and then what I was able to do at EA that kind of doubled down, we were focusing on creating a new art form, treating people as creative people and artists. And the organization as a whole was really committed to constant innovation. We had a very open work culture, what you would call flat organization. So anybody can talk to anybody. There were no private offices. Nobody flew first class in an airplane. We're all flying coach class. I mean, it was a one class society for the purpose of innovation, and risks were encouraged. Mistakes were celebrated. It's like if you made a mistake, it's like, hey, way to go. You're pushing the envelope. Okay, now what did you learn? Because we want to teach the entire company the lessons, because we don't like making the same mistakes. We want to make new and different mistakes.
Out of interest, my first book was titled Do, Fail, Learn, Repeat. I had 10 failed startups before I got my first successful one.
Yeah, and you have to not mind the failure.
I want to ask you the last two quick-fire questions. The first is, what are you curious about right now?
Well, this is a tough one here in America. My question is, can my fellow Americans wake up? Can we see Trump for what he is? Can we get him out of office? Can we restore an actual democracy? And I obsess about that question every day.
Amazing. And I'm sure from that obsession will come some interesting answers and solutions in the next year. And I imagine that the final question is going to be quite tied to that. What is keeping you up at night?
Exactly.
The self-same thing.
I'm really worried. There's a lot of Americans that are really worried. This is just uncharted territory.
Trip, thank you so much. It was an absolute pleasure talking to you, and you gave me more time than I could have expected. I thoroughly enjoyed it.
My pleasure, Nick. God bless.
Thank you for listening to the Curious Cult podcast, the show where we talk to incredible people about their fascinating curiosity. If you like this episode, please rate the show, like it, share it, and generally be kind to us and tell people about it. My goal is to spark curiosity that changes the world, and you can help by talking about the show to anyone who will listen. Stay curious. Until next time.